I lifted the ledger under the lamplight and found whole rows of names gouged out with a blunt instrument. Suspicion tightened my jaw as I turned the page. The handwriting changed, the ink ran thin in places, and where dates should have stood there were ragged white scars on the paper. Jonas set a pale beam from his inspection lamp across the margin and said, "Those are deliberate." I touched the torn edge with my gloved fingertip and felt grit where glue had been scraped away. Within the first minute the problem was visible and concrete. Deaths had been removed from the record, not lost to time but taken out by hands that wanted them gone. That suspicion made me reach for every nearby volume. It made me refuse to leave with the ledger closed. I work at the university archives. I am Dr. Miriam Hale. I had been alone in the reading room until Jonas, the junior assistant, pushed open the heavy door and called my name. He set the lamp beside me and said, "I thought you were finished, Miriam." I looked up and answered, "Not until I know why someone erased these names." The tension in my voice came from a practical place. A ledger is evidence, and an erased line is a changed fact. My hands moved fast. I opened parish rolls, compared columns, and watched dates that should have matched parish burials fail to match. That pattern, missing entries paired with certain social categories, was the central problem that decided every choice I would make that night. Jonas read aloud a smudged entry and tried to pronounce the name. "It looks like Thomas." Then a scratch. He tapped the torn place twice. Elias, a graduate researcher who came in with a stack of microfilm, bent his head close and said, "We need to cross-check the poorhouse lists." This repeats where laborers vanish from the rolls. The room tightened. In those 5 sentences the stakes were visible. If ledgers had been altered, institutional accounting of deaths was unreliable, and some lives had been made disappear on purpose. Doubt arrived in the shape of a question. Who chose which names to remove? That doubt pushed me to gather more paper and to work through the night. I paged through parish registers in the reading room while the lamp burned and the clock above the stacks ticked. Every action carried weight. I penciled a marginal note. I closed one book and opened another. I held a photograph to the light. Ms. Klein, the head archivist, walked in with her keys and her practical cardigan. She smelled of starch and tea. I asked her directly, "Ms. Klein, were pages removed from these ledgers?" She looked at the torn edges, at the scraped ink, and said, "Some volumes are in poor condition. We keep them secure." Her tone was careful. The word careful felt like a shield. I pushed, asking for access logs and repair receipts. She gave me protocols and citations about preservation, but declined to authorize unsupervised access to sealed boxes. Her evasiveness shifted my doubt to irritation. I reshelved a set of registers more forcefully than necessary. Elias and I spent the next hours tracing a pattern. We matched names that appeared on wage lists with entries on the parish roll, and then with poorhouse ledgers. Each match we expected to find showed a blank instead. Elias, look, tent cities, transient lodgers, day laborers, the same categories vanish. His voice tightened into a fuller concern. I felt the second emotion shift then. The doubt became a low, steady fear that institutions had deliberately uncounted certain people to keep statistics neat and reputations clean. I tapped my pen twice when a name seemed important, the small habit that often told me when to trust a lead. At 2 a.m. I took the ledger to Ms. Klein's office and set it on her desk. Light from the lamp hit dust on the surface and made a rectangle on the blotter where others had rested their hands. I said, "These names were removed. The pattern is consistent, Ms." Klein smoothed her cardigan and replied, "We cannot make accusations without more context, Miriam." I pressed her, speaking in sharp, short sentences. Who authorized removals? Who signed off the repairs? Who decided which records to keep private? She glanced toward the filing cabinet and then said, "The archive answers to the university. The board handles sensitive issues." The word board was meant to end the subject. It did not. Her reticence created a new obstacle. Institutional defensiveness that would block me from formal channels. I left the office and found Elias in the stacks. He had microfilm unspooling and his finger on a timestamp. "There is a marginal note here," he said. "Thousands are marked transferred or unclaimed. But transfers have no destinations." He held up the strip. I read the cramped clerk handwriting, a 5-word note squeezed along a ledger margin. I could not make out all of it. Jonas came back with a small sheaf of loose papers he had found between binders. His hands shook when he handed them over. "This looked like trash at first," he said. "Then I saw this note." It was a cramped line from an earlier clerk who had jotted a burial place and then crossed it out. Jonas, why would someone cross that out? That question was the external event that pushed the investigation from curiosity to duty. The marginalia redirected our search toward a physical place linked to erased names. We split tasks. Jonas checked transfer receipts and storage logs. Elias looked through poorhouse ledgers, reading names aloud. I went to the microfilm room and matched dates. Each discovery forced a decision: when to confront them. Klein went to press Mr. Barrett, the administrator who oversaw the archives, and when to ask for keys I had no right to keep. I felt the third emotion shift here. Doubt shifted again into resolve to act, but my actions were careful, not theatrical. I asked Elias, "If we find a burial ground that matches these notes, will you present the cross references?" He nodded, flat and deliberate. Jonas set a flashlight into the satchel and said, "I'll come with you if you go after hours." Their willingness was not abstract support. It was a practical agreement to share risk. Mr. Barrett summoned me at 4 a.m. His office smelled of coffee and old plaster. He spoke quietly and with rehearsed patience. "Drew to Hale, I hear you have concerns." I put the ledger on his desk and left it open. "These names were erased, Mr. Barrett." People were removed from the ledgers. He held the edge of the page between two fingers and said, "Accusations like that can damage the university's standing," I answered. "Not acknowledging the dead is not a reputational issue. It's an ethical failure." He leaned back and said, "You risk legal complications if you publish preliminary claims." The tone attempted a warning, but his words did not change the record. The administrator's caution was an explicit barrier. He offered counsel about process and suggested I follow protocol. I left with paperwork to file, not with answers. Dawn crept pale through high windows when Jonas found a stapled bundle of mortuary receipts tucked behind an old map case. I unfolded them at a lamplit table. The receipts listed burials with cryptic notations: unmarked, county grave, anonymous, Mrs. Greeley, the longtime caretaker of the off-campus storage room, arrived shortly after and watched us without speaking. She had cared for these records for decades and knew their rhythms. I said, "Mrs. Greeley, do you remember anyone altering records?" She pursed her lips and shook her head, then paused as if choosing which memory to give. "Not openly," she said, "but hands change and orders travel." Once the university wanted certain matters quiet, her eyes moved to the bundle of receipts. A short story about a shipment of bodies from a nearby workhouse in which names were recorded as transferred and then never appeared elsewhere. Her testimony punctured official denials and added a human voice to the paper trail. The arrival of Mrs. Greeley and her recollection was a turning point. Documentation and memory aligned. We decided to check the neglected mortuary storage off campus. The caretaker at the gate frowned when we said we were from the archive. He for identification and then allowed us in reluctantly. The storage room smelled of tar and damp wood. Boxes were stacked and numbered. We pried open a crate and found ledger pages packed into oilcloth, photographs spilled out, small prints of funerals with faces half obscured by hats. I held a photograph and named a man in the back row aloud. "Elias, that man appears on a wage list, but not in the parish book." I read the underside of the photograph and found the name partially rubbed off. The tactile action of turning photographs made the losses visible. Each photograph with its rubbed name was a small proof that someone had wanted these people anonymous. We forced the lock on a sealed storage vault that had not been opened in years. Fatigue made my fingers clumsy. Inside, ledgers lay in dust, and an oil lamp left a ghost ring on the crate lid. I pried open one book and saw line after line where names were scratched out with a steady hand. Ms. Klein stood by the door when we opened that crate. She faced the shelved bundles and said nothing at first. Then she read a struck through name and folded her hands. She explained softly that some records had been redacted during past decades to protect donor interests or to avoid scandal. I asked, "Who authorized that?" She answered, "Orders came from committees." I was not on those committees then. Her voice did not deny complicity, it deflected it. The vault filled the room with a new pressure. Evidence of deliberate erasure confronted institutional memory. The crate held more than struck names. We found paper bags containing lists of burials marked only as anonymous and envelopes with badly photocopied coroner's notes. One envelope contained a small map with a plot marked in ink and a name partially visible beneath a folded corner. Jonas whispered, "This is a burial ground." "It matches Mrs. Greeley's note." My hands tightened on the ledger. The chapter's climax arrived at that concrete reveal. A vault of scratched names and bagged records that together proved systematic concealment. I looked at Ms. Klein and asked, "Will you help me make these names visible again?" She paused for a long moment, her fingers on the crate lip, then said, "I will not stand in the way of proper research." "But be careful, Miriam." That was her decision, public cooperation with caution, not a promise of full disclosure. We left the vault with copies and a list that grew by the hour. Back at the lamplit table in the reading room, Jonas, Elias, and I read aloud the names as we transcribed them. Short names, foreign names we hesitated over, initials. We spoke them clearly, and in turn Elias read and I wrote. Jonas taped a photographic print to the ledger's margin to keep the face with the name. Our actions were small and concrete: copying, taping, circling dates, adding a tiny caret where a surname had been torn away. Each act was a choice to preserve identity. The emotional tone settled into a quiet determination. The fear that had tightened my throat earlier now shaped a steady, practical ritual. We accepted that our work might cost reputation and comfort, but we continued. There was a twist that night. A repair receipt slipped out from between glued pages bearing an unfamiliar signature. A clerk who had since become a university official with current oversight. Jonas read the name and said, "This connects to someone still in power." Elias looked up and said, "This changes how we present our findings." The twist altered our strategy. This was not merely historical neglect, but linked to living individuals who might react to exposure. We spent the next hours arranging copies, making notes, and deciding which records to preserve privately first. The immediate surprise forced us to slow and to plan. An external event happened. Mr. Barrett called during transcription to say that the university would audit any public release. His call shifted the urgency. It put legal and reputational risk into the present. We resolved the chapter's immediate conflict at dawn by making a concrete plan. Jonas would catalog the copied names in a secure file. Elias would prepare cross-referenced pages with microfilm stamps and citations. I would draft a memo to the Records Committee requesting a review of sealed boxes. We did not frame these tasks as speeches. They were lists of actions with deadlines. When I sealed the final envelope containing our copied names, I slipped the brass pocket watch from my satchel and set it on top. The watch ticked once, loud in the quiet room. I stood and buttoned my tweed coat. Jonas and Elias moved with the same methodical calm. We left the reading room together. As I closed the heavy door behind me, someone else pushed it from the hall. Ms. Klein returned with a key. She held the key in her hand and said, "I have authorized temporary access to certain boxes. For your safety, tell no one outside this room." I nodded and placed the sealed envelope in my satchel. The final paragraph of this chapter ends not with an abstract promise but with a concrete action. I walked out into the grey morning, the satchel heavy, and the sealed list of names against my ribs. Jonas locked the reading room and slipped the microfilm into his coat. Elias carried the crate photographs to his bag. The lamp in the window flicked once and then settled as the building's first janitor turned the corner and began his rounds. The ledger stayed open on the table, a witness with scored names waiting for the next hand to read them. My throat was tight and my hands smelled of dust and oil. I felt the small relief of tasks assigned and the ongoing pressure of possible consequences, but the immediate act was simple and specific. I would present the copied names to the Records Committee and insist on a formal review. That decision closed the chapters contained conflict, evidence discovered, witnesses consulted, and a plan in motion, while leaving the larger institutional reckoning to come. I walked down the archive corridor with Jonas and Elias beside me. The sun lifting pale over the university spires and the weight of the sealed envelope a steady reminder of what we had chosen to do next. The crate fell silent the moment I forced its lid. I had grabbed the handcart as the porters turned a corner, and I hauled my weight against the wood. One nail snapped and the lid gave. Paper burst out in a small cloud. Jonas swore and shoved his lantern closer. "Jonas, stop. Don't bundle it back," I said. Suspicion tightened my fingers on the crate's rim and pushed my feet forward. The suspicion had been with me since the ledger under lamplight showed rows of names gouged out. That sight made me watch gestures and file lists with a different eye. Within 5 minutes, this crate made the problem concrete. Death paperwork was being removed from the archive instead of catalogue. Jonas crouched and began pulling laminated tags free with deliberate care. His breath fogged in the corridor. "Who sent this to disposal?" he asked. I pushed the nearest bundle open and found brittle coroner slips. Dates matched a cluster I had flagged last week. I said the dates aloud. Jonas read the same numbers and his face changed. A porter ran a hand over the crate and said, "Marked for discard." Orders from records. I remembered the ledger again, the one I had lifted under lamplight, where whole rows of names had been gouged out with a blunt instrument. That earlier discovery had made me look for patterns. Now a pattern was in my hands. I set a lamp on the handcart and spread the slips across the corridor floor. They were thin, cigarette smoke brown at the edges, stamped with ward numbers and shorthand causes. Some tags had names. Many had only numbers. "Jonas," I said, pulling one slip toward me. "These ward numbers, wards 3, 5, 9. They match recent missing death reports." Jonas leaned in. "You found that ledger too?" "Yes," I said. "This is the same set." My voice was small against the corridor stone. The suspicion that had driven me this far shifted into something sharper. A demand to know who decided which lives to list and which to ignore. We moved to the processing room with lanterns and the crate between us. The room smelled of paste and cold metal. A single bulb swung above the sorting table and made a narrow pool of light. We laid the slips like a small, ragged map. I read names slowly, tapping twice on each one that looked like it should have been filed. My fingers were stained with ink from other days. I felt that stain as a weight now. Jonas brought a stack of unfiled tags and set them down. "Look," he said, and pointed to a typed memo tucked between coroner slips. The memo was stamped in red, "Exclude." I lifted it. The registrar's initials were on the bottom. The language was precise, almost bureaucratic, but the instruction could not be clearer. "Keep these cases from the official registers." Jonas, the registrar's name. I had heard that name in faculty meetings. The paper cut a thin line through the compartmentalized calm of the archive. For a moment, we both sat in the processing room and listened to the bulb swing. My reaction to the memo moved from suspicion to a compact, physical set of choices. I folded the memo under a heavy book and took a deep, measured breath. "We can't leave this where Langley can find it," I said. "We need proof tied to municipal records." Jonas nodded. He moved faster than his face suggested. "There's a microfilm index in the old room. Asha, she found odd margins notes there last month. We found Asha in the microfilm room with the machine's glass plate up. She was threading film with a steady hand." "Asha," I said, and the name pulled her eyes up. She smiled, quick and tight. "You should have warned me you were coming at this hour," she said. Her voice had a student quickness and a measured edge. I asked her if she had the film with the municipal poorhouse indexes. She slid a strip toward me. The index had names and numbers, but several lines were crossed out in red ink. In the margin, a small note read, "See sealed envelopes, numbered." Asha's fingers found my wrist. "To hail, these crosses are recent. Someone has been marking these since the ledger showed you the gouged rows. Whoever marked them knew where to look." "Jonas, follow the numbers to the poorhouse records." He tapped the film. "If the names match our slips, that's deliberate omission." The three of us moved to the municipal poorhouse records after hours. The building was a squat brick box, and the records room smelled of oil. We chose to take the back stairs to avoid cameras. My watch read 11. The lock on the cabinet resisted at first. Asha's fingers found the old key she'd taken months ago while cataloging. She had kept it hidden in a notebook. Her choice to keep that key had been a small, quiet defiance. We fit it in, turned, heard the mechanism slide, and the cabinet opened with a dry sound. Inside were envelopes arranged by number, no names. I felt a cold knot of betrayal. Someone had replaced names with numbers to hide them. We pulled envelopes out in batches. Jonas counted. He read numbers aloud and I matched them to the slips spread across my lap. The match was exact. For every tag in our crate, there was a sealed envelope here carrying only numbers. Asha, they filed by number to avoid names. We found a ledger wrapped in oilcloth at the back of the cabinet. The outer cloth had been stitched closed and the stitches were new. I slit them with my penknife and the pages inside were firm but waxed. When I opened it, the name columns had been deliberately blanked out. There were bundles of numbered tags where names should have been. At the back, folded and creased, lay a typed confession. Someone had listed the names of officials and cited instructions to omit. The confession bore a signature and an official stamp. My jaw tightened. Betrayal moved like a hard current through me. My hands trembled enough that the page fluttered. We had to decide quickly. We were surrounded by legal exposure and by the knowledge that these papers changed reputations. Jonas whispered, "Langley will shut this down himself. He'll call security. Asha, we can photograph the ledger. We'll copy enough to make the pattern clear." She pulled out a small camera and worked the angle. Light from our lanterns flashed on inked margins. The photograph recorded the blank columns and the confession. Jonas pried open a sealed envelope and read a list of numbers. He covered his mouth with his free hand. "These are pauper deaths," he said. "These were never counted by the registry." His voice held both dismay and something like furious resolve. We moved with care but not with silence. Footsteps down the hallway told us our time was short. Professor Langley arrived with security less than 5 minutes after we found the ledger. He did not look surprised. He looked controlled. "Hale," he said, voice practiced and level. "You know you can't remove material from campus holdings in that manner." I set the ledger on the table and did not meet his eyes. "Professor Langley, there are names that were kept off the registers. This is an internal directive. It says exclude." Langley put a hand on the ledger and did not open it. "You shouldn't have broken the cabinet lock, Miriam. You compromised the chain of custody." Asha stepped forward. "Professor Langley, someone signed an order. This is about decisions, not procedure." Langley's voice tightened, but he used measured faculty tones. "Asha, you are impertinent." "Jonas, step back." The security officer moved in a small arc. I watched Langley do the work of containment. He bent and looked at the typed confession. "This document is a forgery if you intend it as proof. Political aims often produce curious papers." Jonas wiped at his hands. "Professor Langley, you said in the meeting last month that you prioritized the archive's reputation." Langley met his eye. "Reputation matters." He turned to me. "Miriam, hand over anything you've copied and I will arrange an internal review." Asha spoke fast, words clipped. "Langley, we have matching municipal slips. These are not internal, they are external records. If we hand them over, you will bury them. You did it with the ledger edits." Langley drew a track of slow breath. He looked at security. The security officer took a step forward. The air in the room felt tight around the argument. I felt my heartbeat move into my throat. This was the point where choices would define me. If I handed over the materials, the evidence might be suppressed. If I resisted, I risked arrest and loss of access. My chest felt hollow. My hands chose for me. I already had copies. I set the original confession and the ledger gently aside and held up the camera's memory card in my hand. "I will not hand over the originals tonight," I said. My voice was flat, "but I will not destroy them. I will take copies to the registrar's office and to the municipal clerk. If you try to seize those copies, you force the archive into a public fight." Langley studied me as if weighing a fragile object. "You are threatening the institution," he said. "You know what that does to careers." "Jonas, Professor Langley, whose career are we protecting? The ones whose names were removed." He let silence hang after the question. Langley made a tight sound and then leaned closer, his face even closer to mine. Conversation narrowed. "Miriam, you are making a choice that will endanger your position here. Consider that." Asha stepped between us and the ledger. "Do you deny the names?" she asked. Her voice had a student edge, and her eyes shone with tired anger. She wanted to name people. That movement shifted the room. Langley looked at her and then at Jonas. "You will all leave now," he said. "We will discuss this in the morning." Security blocked the doorway, but Langley did not try to take the materials from us. He had left room for the archive's formal mechanisms. I closed the oilcloth over the ledger and re-tied the thread. My hands had steadied. Betrayal had not gone away. It had become a decision point. Outside, the night air hit us and our lanterns threw small circles of yellow on the pavement. Jonas crouched at the curb and began to take photographs of the ledger's edge through the oilcloth. Asha kept watch and fed me details in soft, clipped sentences. I copied the microfilm note and the crossed names, she said. I also took a photo of the registrar's signature on the memo. We returned to the lamplit office in a line that kept us out of cameras. I took the copied slips and the photograph from Jonas and spread them on my desk. The lamplight fell in a steady pool. My papers were neat. The document of confession sat face up. I forced my hands to move carefully as I made duplicates. Each duplication was a small act against someone else's decision. When I thumbed the last photograph into place, a new fear undercut the resolve in my throat. If the ledger and the confession were true, whole lives had been recorded only with numbers, not names. If the official registry had excluded them, the families, if any, had no paper trail. The memory of the gouged-out names in the ledger returned, not as metaphor but as a physical thing. The blunt gouge marks across ink where someone had once written a name. I touched the memory as I touched the paper. The emotion moved from suspicion to a cold grief that pushed me to action. Asha sat opposite me and watched the lamplight make little bright lines across her notebook. Miriam, what will you do in the morning? Her tone was direct. I looked at her and chose words that would hold both promise and consequence. I will submit a packet to the municipal clerk. Jonas will file a duplicate with the county records, and you will prepare the microfilm screens for the assembly. We expose the pattern with external records. Jonas snorted softly. You really want to start a fight with Langley, Miriam? He used my name like a small argument and his rhythm was practical. I answered with a short list. We go with public, external proof. We do not confront Langley privately. We create a record that cannot be quietly refiled. Asha nodded once. Good. I'll prepare the evidence. She paused. And Jonas, you need to print those copies you took. Jonas pushed his glasses up and started to sort the photographs. He had always been careful with procedure and the small, precise acts suited him. His choices mattered now. He moved like someone who had learned to make truth into something that could be handed to systems. We worked until the lamplight dwindled and I felt the building settle into a hush. Every few minutes my hands stopped. I would run back through the processing room in my head and remember someone else's action. A registrar initialed the memo. A clerk crossed the microfilm lines. The stitches on the oilcloth had been fresh. Those concrete details were what I had. The ledger from the previous chapter, the gouged names, had prepared me to see these specifics. I used them like tools. The knock came after midnight. I heard it before the knock, a heavy footstep on the corridor, then a pound against my door. Asha looked up and Jonas froze. I set down the camera card and walked to the door with a steadiness I did not feel. I opened it a fraction. Professor Langley stood there with his coat buttoned and one hand in his pocket. Behind him were two security officers whose faces I had seen in the records office. Langley did not smile. Miriam, he said, I must insist you hand over the materials you removed from the municipal cabinet. I kept my feet square. Professor Langley, I have copies and I have a plan to submit them. If you seize these copies tonight, you remove the only independent evidence we can give the clerk. Langley lifted a hand. You are forcing my choice. If you proceed publicly, you will make enemies here. If you desist, you will preserve your position. I looked at him and saw the ledger's blank columns in his face, the way he weighed custody over truth. Then I reached into my satchel and slid the camera card across the desk, where Langley could not take it without reaching inside. My hands did not shake when they had to be precise. They only shook when I had to show courage. Langley took the card. He studied it for a long, thin moment, and then his expression flattened. He handed it back. We will have an internal review, he said. No public steps until then. Asha's lips were pressed together. Jonas muttered a protest under his breath. I closed the door on their waiting steps and sat down at the desk again. The lamplight made the page edges glow and I set the copied slips in a neat pile. My chest eased and then tightened. There was a sense of small victory, and an understanding that our next steps would be harder. I turned the photograph face down for a minute and then slid it into a slim envelope. Before I left the office that night, I placed the copied slips into an inner pocket of my leather satchel. The brass of my pocket watch felt cool when I closed it over the stack. I had proof and I had begun the work of disseminating it. I also had a ledger wrapped in oilcloth and a typed confession whose signature would force inquiry. The aftermath of the confrontation left a quiet resolve rather than triumph. My choices had consequences. Langley would respond with procedure. The municipal clerk would have a decision to make. I turned the key in my satchel's buckle and felt the weight of paper against my ribs. A faint dust smell rose from my sleeve as I moved. Then there came a single knock on the office door, soft but distinct. I tightened my fingers on the satchel strap, then opened the door. Jonas stood there with 2 printed copies in his hands and Asha behind him with a microfilm strip tucked into her palm. "Jonas," I said. "Asha." "Good. Place them on the desk. Lock the door." They did. Jonas set the copies down. Asha fed the microfilm into the reader and the projector hummed quietly. The screen showed the crossed names and the marginal note pointing to sealed envelopes. The image was blunt and concrete. We all looked at it, and our faces were lit by the small, plain light of evidence. I sat down, closed the leather satchel over the copied slips, and set the worn photograph of the ledger on top. I breathed out. The grief I had felt was still there, but it had a shape I could work with. I made a list in my head of the next day's moves. Deliver copies to the municipal clerk, notify a sympathetic county official, enlist a legal advisor for chain of custody questions, prepare a statement that used facts alone. The ledger's gouged columns had taught me to seek facts, not flourish. I would name names where names existed on other paperwork. I would not use rhetoric. Outside, the campus clock chimed 1, the building whispered. The evidence table was a small island of light. Jonas and Asha moved to the window to watch the courtyard. They spoke with low voices about printing and lists. Their tones were procedural and urgent. I placed my brass pocket watch on the ledger's edge and closed my fingers around it, feeling the cool metal and the weight of a watch that had timed other people's days. I slid the photograph into the inside cover of my battered notebook and zipped the satchel. I stood, and my knees felt steady. I took the copied slips from the inner pocket, folded them once, and slid them into the envelope marked for the municipal clerk. I left the original ledger wrapped and hidden under my desk drawer. I put the camera card into my coat pocket. Then I turned off the lamp and walked to the door. On the threshold I paused and looked back at the table where the projector still threw the crossed names on the wall. I let the image register. Concrete names crossed in red ink, an instruction stamped to exclude, a typed confession bearing a signature. I locked the office behind me and felt the night press against the door as I stepped into the corridor. My hands had done what my suspicion demanded. I had moved from suspicion to action, and from action to a plan that would expose what had been hidden. I had not resolved the institutional web that would wait for the clerk's response and for whatever Langley chose to do next. For now, I closed my satchel and set my steps toward the municipal building, each footfall a small, deliberate decision to make the uncounted visible. A knock came again at the outer door and someone else moved in the corridor. I tightened my grip on the satchel and walked out into the night.